Well, on behalf of all the members of the Black in Gerontology and Geriatrics community, we would like to welcome you to this webinar entitled Older Black Men and Aging Research, What We Should Know. Our webinar today is supported by American Geriatric Society, Grantmakers in Aging, Southern Gerontological Society, American Society on Aging, and Healthy Aging Section Fellows of New York Academy of Medicine. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the BIGG website. And a notice to all of you, we will distribute the recording of this webinar to all of you once it's available. Well, so let's tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're joined today by expert researchers and practitioners, and I will let them introduce themselves, Drs. Antonia Skipper and Christopher Howard, and they will not introduce themselves in a minute. And our agenda for today is that our experts will provide their insights on how to do research involving older Black men who are often underrepresented and they're always marginalized in aging research. Even in research on issues that affect them the most, they are marginalized. So we recognize that these are difficult conversations sometimes, and we want to make sure that we want to provide a safe space for everybody. So we want to encourage you that if you at any point feel uncomfortable, you can unmute and you can also leave the chat to take a break. Please take care of your mental health because that's important to us. Now, for the instructions that we're going to follow today, we'll have a question and answer session that is moderated, right? And then we will also have 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So you will ask questions to our panelists and we'll give you an opportunity to interact with the panelists. So you can also use the chat function to put your question in the chat box area, and we will monitor the chat box area and ask your questions as needed. So without further ado, allow me to introduce two of the most accomplished friends that I've met this morning. And I would like Dr. Skipper to go first. Introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you are, and what you do in terms of research in aging.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. Foremost, it's a pleasure to join you all this afternoon. My name is Dr. Antonia Skipper. I am currently an assistant professor of gerontology at Georgia State University in the Gerontology Institute. I've been in my current role for just over a year, so the start of my second year here at Georgia State. Prior to that time, I was an assistant professor of gerontology at Winston-Salem State University, where we had one of the very few gerontology programs at a HBCU. My research largely considers the dynamics of romantic relationships, religion, and health for middle and old aged African Americans. So with that, I've worked alongside colleagues at BYU, Brigham Young University, Dr. Lauren Marks, Dr. Dave Dollahite on a project called the American Families of Faith Project. There we've interviewed now over 250 families from diverse faith backgrounds, really just understanding the role of religion and faith in family and what that means. And so my particular focus has been on African American families. And I'm working from a data set currently of about 45 middle to old age African American couples, and looking at the role of faith and just all of the things that kind of go into building a strong family. And so with that, I've largely taken this strength-focused perspective to counter many of the deficit narratives that we hear around what it means to be older and Black, or an older Black family, or the lack of stability in Black communities. And so I've really been using this strength-focused agenda to counter a lot of that. I've also done a bit of work with older Black men. So I'm currently an OHD Pride Fellow, where I work under Dr. Roland Thorpe on a project that explores the association between obesity and religious service attendance for middle and old age Black men. I'm also working with the Michigan Integrative Wellbeing and Equality Program, where I'm working with Dr. Robert Taylor on a project that's looking at vaccine hesitance and kind of things that are contributing to vaccine hesitance, particularly for older African Americans and older Black men as well. And so considering things such as religion, considering things such as community, relationships, all of those things that are kind of fighting back against the push for the COVID-19 vaccine right now. And so that's kind of what I have going on currently. I've worked in aging for, I would say, probably about 10 years now. Prior to getting my PhD, I worked for the Atlanta Housing Authority. And so I was able to develop a lot of relationships with the community and with people that are in the African-American community in and around Atlanta. And so those things have kind of helped me to grow my research agenda and really kind of build who it is that I am within this space.
I told you they were qualified. Thank you, Dr. Skipper. All right, so Dr. Howard, the bar is set really low for you.
Yes, first I want to say thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here and having the opportunity to contribute. So my name is Dr. Christopher Howard, and currently I'm a postdoc fellow at the Utah State Hospital, but also have research responsibilities at Brigham Young University, BYU University, where we kind of utilize neuroimaging techniques to study how changes in the brain structure influence cognition and behavior. So leading up to this point, the majority of my interests have centered on African Americans' cognitive aging and health disparities. And in order to fortify, these interests of mine, I've worked with the program at University of Michigan, MCAR, Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research, and I did a research fellowship at North Carolina under the tutelage of Dr. Goldie Bird with their COACH program, Center for Outreach, Alzheimer's Aging, Center for Health. So yeah, in addition to like some of the academic stuff, community outreach has been a really huge thing that I've done. Like particularly when I was in Chicago, I created Neuro Nerds, where we go to some of the underserved communities throughout Chicago and try to promote Alzheimer's awareness. And then we developed the 501c, and the 501c was an amazing opportunity to really delve in and put on events for like different communities and stuff, and really have an opportunity just to have people ask questions so we can answer questions. Because one of the biggest things that we kind of realize is people have questions, but they don't always know the type of questions to ask, where to go, what to think about, different things and stuff. But sometimes when you're in a position to help them answer the question, then, it usually yields a great outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. And we're really privileged to have you both here. And thank you for taking the time to be with us. So I'll jump into the moderated questions, like I said before, and then after this, we'll let the crowd come in and ask us questions as well. So the question number one that we have for you today is, why does aging and health of Black men matter? So basically, why is it that it's important for you to study aging and health of Black older men? I'll go with Dr. Skipper first.
Thank you. So, why does aging and health of Black men matter? It really kind of relates to two reasons for me, and I really take it personal. Like it's kind of on a personal level. So I understand we have our professional, role as well, but it really boils down to both life expectancy and quality of life. When we think about those things in relation to Black men, it kind of bothers me on a personal level that Black men have the shortest life expectancy of any racial gender group in the U.S. And I think we've seen it grow even more and become even more of an issue with COVID-19. And, everyone had this dip in life expectancy as a result of COVID-19, but particularly for Black men. And so I think a big part of kind of addressing the disparities that are impacting Black men is related to research. And when I say, thinking about these disparities, I'm not necessarily just talking about hypertension or heart disease or cancers or those type of things, but really thinking about the whole person, improving the quality of life for Black men, the mental health, the physical health, the social health, all of those things. And I think that's where we really have to kind of dig into, because a lot of times it's not just a physical health issue. And when we talk about Black men's health, we have to be really broad to recognize that Black men are impacted by a number of systemic issues as well. And so if we're going to talk about the health of Black men, we have to talk about oppression. We have to talk about discrimination. We have to talk about incarceration, and we have to even talk about cultural beliefs and some of those things that, you know, we as Black men may be doing that are negative impacting our health as well. And so the list kind of really goes on, but it's about understanding the dynamics of what it means to, you know, be a man, be older, and be Black. And I think all three of those things have different implications. And then when we combine them together, you know, we see, you know, a different picture of what it means to be an older Black man. And so when I think about the question, like, you know, why does the aging and health of Black men matter? I'm reminded of, you know, kind of the frame of thought around Black Lives Matter. And so, of course, you'll say Black Lives Matter, and people are going to counter and say, well, all lives matter, and things of that nature. But when we really dig down into it, it's not to say that, you know, everybody's health doesn't matter, but right now, Black men are being impacted in ways that other groups are not. And so we need this focused attention on the health experiences of Black men to both increase and improve quality of life and increase life expectancy. And so it's not about necessarily neglecting other groups, but really recognizing where we can do a better job with Black men across the life course to help them improve their health.
Thank you, Dr. Skipper. And there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I just wanted to underline real quick. First of all, you talked about the intersectionality of being a Black man, going through systemic things, etc. But you also mentioned that there are things that Black men are going through that other groups are not.
Yes.
So could you please speak to that explicitly? What are these things that Black men are going through that other groups are not going through?
One of the things particularly that I brought up is discrimination, you know, discrimination and oppression. And a lot of times we have, as Black men and in the Black community, it's become so common that many times we don't recognize the things that are impacting us until it starts to affect our health. And so when we think about, you know, narratives such as John Henry and John Henryism and the belief that, you know, well, if I just work harder, then I'll eventually get to where it is that I want to be. But there are so many systemic things such as discrimination or oppression and things that are kind of working against us that we may not necessarily be doing ourselves a favor by working harder. And so it's really about reframing the narrative and helping Black men to realize that you have to take care of yourself. Something that I've, you know, become really excited about is the conversations have grown around Black men's health and mental health. And I think social media has kind of contributed to that. So that's been an encouraging thing to see. And the research around that area has grown really over the last decade. But I think that we have to have more conversations around the societal factors that are impacting us and how we're responding to them, because those things have real life health implications.
I really like what you just said there, that in most cases, we always talk about the disparity, but we don't really drill down into the societal things that are creating these disparities. So thank you for that. Dr. Howard, if you'd like to respond to the same question, why does the aging and health of Black men matter?
Yeah, you know, I think it's like really important, but I think it's one of those things that aren't talked about. Like, I think there's this pursuit of manhood. And when I say pursuit of manhood, like when I was just kind of prepping for this, one of the things that when we were looking, that was kind of talking about like different stressors that African Americans face and that African American men encounter is like, it's this Black male ethos, if you will. And it's like, I want to be recognized as a man. I want to work hard. I want to be fulfilled. And I do this backbreaking work. When you think about allostatic load, you think about weathering, you think about John Henryism, you think about all these things. And then when you look at it statistically, African American men don't get paid as much. You know, there's, you know, more systemic things at the job. And it's even slight factors too, right? Like, I want to come in, I want to show people that I'm not aggressive, that you can work with me. And sometimes in a way that I have to dwarf myself, or I have to become more docile in order to show you that I'm not aggressive so I can be included, because everybody knows that when you work together as a team, then you can usually yield a better result. But a lot of times African American men tend to be ostracized, right? And it creates this conundrum where, okay, well, you know, he's not smart, he's not whatever the case may be, but it's like, well, you didn't include me also. So I think mental health is a huge component, because what you end up finding is that a lot of African American men suffer in silence, right? And you think about why do they suffer in silence? The first thing is like kind of systemic, because when you look at normal people and you say, okay, what does depression look like? What does anxiety look like, right? It's this frame of psychopathology, but that frame of psychopathology is not inclusive to the Black experience, because when African Americans, when we experience level of depression and stuff, like we're not morose, we're not crying, we're not sad, but sometimes it can come off as anger. Sometimes we have these psychosomatic problems, my back hurt, my knee hurts, whatever the case may be. Or, you know, if it gets bad enough, then sometimes there's a component of psychosis that's affiliated with a level of depression and stuff, right? But that doesn't mirror what people would expect for depression to look like. So as a result, we don't get the same types of help, right? Or sometimes people dismiss their problems. And what ends up happening is that when you speak to African American men, it's like, what's the point of going to the doctor? They don't believe me. They poke, they prod, things a little bit more painful. I could do better all by myself, right? And that shouldn't be the case. And representation matters. Like, this is one of the things why I work so diligently towards African American men and raising mental health awareness, is so that these groups of people don't have to suffer in silence. Because what ends up happening is that when you get people to break the shell, or you get African American men to break the shell, they hurt, they have pain, they have things they want to talk about, they have their ups, they have their downs, they have a number of different things that they don't necessarily readily get a chance to express, because they want to hold on to this this male ethos, like, I gotta be tough, I gotta be strong, my family's depending on me. And as a result of included stressors and lack of places to get help, like, we're dying so much earlier, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Thank you. You said a lot of things there that we could unpack all day here. So, but I wanted, yeah, no, thank you. I wanted to respond to a couple of things here. You talked about they don't believe me anyway, so why am I going? So I think that kind of spoke loudly to me. And then also you talked about breaking the shell. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
So first of all, what creates the shell, and what are some ways that shell has been broken in the cases that you've seen?
Representation matters, like, and I think that's the biggest thing with mental health. Like, mental health is overwhelmingly white. But I remember I was working with Dr. Monica Parker with her Emory Alzheimer's team in Atlanta. And she said, you're going to be an amazing asset, and you just don't realize it yet. And I'm like, why? And she was just like, you got to think, right? The people who were, she was like, the people that we're working with, they want to see a you. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? And she's like, you're a young African-American male, you're college educated, you're part of a Black letter Greek organization, Kappa Alpha Psi, you know, and you're interested in doing what we want to do. So what ends up happening is that when women see you, the first thing that they want to do is call their husbands, their nephews, their brothers, their whomever, because there's a level of familiarity with you. And so when they talk to you, they don't feel like they're being judged, but now they're getting answers. And inevitably, she was right. Like, people would see you, then they would just hold on real quick, let me call whomever and stuff. So that's what it is about breaking the shells, having like a level of familiarity, because a lot of times, one of the problems with psychology, one of the problems with mental health, particularly like as you like climb the ranks, is sometimes you have like a people who, I'm trying to be PC, but like they're not necessarily accustomed to working with people of color or whatever. So the only way that they're familiar with people of color is sometimes what they see on TV, what they see in a newspaper, whatever the case may be. So even if they don't intend to, sometimes they can be dismissive of somebody's experience, and they take this approach like, well, I already know everything. I already know everything. I already know everything. And what ends up happening is that when you dismiss groups of people, they're like, why would I come back? Why would I open up to you? You automatically minimize my experience. So you're just going to tell me something short and simple, and that doesn't really make my life better. You're just going to give me a whole bunch of medications and not explain how these medications work, right? So it just goes back to that narrative. I can do bad all by myself. So representation matters. Like, I think it's incumbent on the field to find ways to get African Americans, particularly African American men, clinicians, to be able to work with different groups of people.
Thank you. And I'm going to go off script here, because the three of us are college educated and we all have acronyms after our names, PhD. So I would like us to talk about that, because you've really emphasized on representation in terms of the professional field. So I'm going to give you each like a minute to speak to this real quick. Talk about your experience being in the aging field, in academia or in clinical work, real quick, Dr. Skipper.
Yeah, one more time. my
Yeah,
camera.
no. It's all good. No worries. We have students here. We have people who are kind of still in the schooling process, and I just want to kind of solicit some feedback from you about representation and how it matters for how to have educated folks who are Black and men in academia, in research, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, as you share, like representation matters. And I think for me, I didn't grow up with a picture of what this looks like. So I didn't know that this was possible. I had no idea that, this field was even here. I was just good at school. And that was it. Like, that was it. I was inquisitive and I was good at school. And so eventually, after I kept going to school, they told me, like, hey, you're going to have to get a job. I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to go back to school. And so that's how I ended up in the academy. But I think that, in being in this role, one of the things that I'm very intentional about is going back to my neighborhood where I didn't see someone like myself. And talking to people and mentoring others that are growing up to say, hey, this is a career and this career offers, several benefits. And this is something that you can actually do. And so I think it's important to kind of have that. It's important for recruiting, as I'll allude to later, that the community sees people like me, I may not necessarily be an older Black man, but they see a Black male, and I'm not just there to take data and run, but I'm actually a member of this community. They don't see me walk in a lab coat or a suit and tie. Like it's dressed down and, hey, this is Skip, and that's how I introduce myself. So it's removing the letters, removing, this person that they may not necessarily trust to say, hey, I'm here and I genuinely just want to help the community. And I think there's a lot of people that are coming behind us that see that representation and can and will do the same thing.
Thank you, Dr. Skipper. Dr. Howard.
There we go. Yeah, you know what? I mean, it was an interesting academic journey. And it's kind of like the gift and the curse. I was like one of the only men in my program, and definitely one of the only African-American men. And one of the things coming from like historically Black college university, like a huge component was community outreach, being involved in stuff. And a lot of my cohort members who came from HBCUs, they still had that same mentality. The only difference was that I wanted to study neuropsychology, and neuropsychology is traditionally white. And I don't mean that like to cast, aspersions on anybody or anything like that, but sometimes when you had these community ideas, they weren't really with it because they were just like, hey, all we do is neuropsych is supposed to be in a vacuumed environment and stuff like that. And I got like a lot of pushback from my school. And me and one of the neuro teachers, we bumped heads, and he shook my transcripts. I put that on Twitter the other day. He shook his transcripts at me and said, "You'll never be a neuropsychologist, and I will never hire somebody like you." And see, this is when I was young. I didn't have the same level of social compartmentalization. And I told him, "You don't go to my community. You're not in my barbershop. You're not in my grocery store. You're not where I'm at. You're not in my church. So when I do my community outreach, I'm not pretending to be a doctor, but what I'm kind of doing is being like Robin Hood, where I'm taking from the rich and giving to the poor." And like when I get this community outreach, the community really wraps its arms around me and say, hey, we may never be a neuropsychologist, but at the same time, you might be the only neuropsychologist we see in a lifetime, and you're invested in our community, right? Like when you do these topics and these presentations, you don't run. And, and I'm so thankful of my church, Greater Holy Temple Church of God in Christ on the west side of Chicago, because what they did was that they let me do myself, right? And they let me do these community projects. And we got the whole west side of Chicago out talking about Alzheimer's. You got billion-dollar institutions who say, hey, we got $1 billion in endowment, but we can't recruit Black Detroit for like research purposes. We can't recruit Atlanta for research purposes, but you're doing it. So, I mean, the academic journey was definitely challenging. I mean, I was broke, I was hungry, but just having the opportunity to like really understand this idea about community neuropsychology and really understanding how to really ingratiate yourself into a community and promote the neurosciences has paid off tremendous, because I got other people I work with who have a high caliber of education, work with amazing professors and stuff. But when it comes to like pounding the pavement and really getting into the communities, that's not a strong point for them. Just real quick, I remember we did some promotion in Atlanta. I attended or Church of Christ at Boulder Crest, East Atlanta, right off Boulder Crest Road. And one of the things and we had an Alzheimer's luncheon. And one of the things that we did to really get people out is that we went through like the neighborhoods that were like right around the church, and we just passed out literature, and we passed out flyers. Hey, this is what we're talking about. This is what we want to do. And it was leading right into Memorial Day. So like they were just giving us food left and right, but we would have like these makeshift conversations and stuff where we're talking to these people in the community in their backyards, and to other family members. They'd be like, baby, we might not be able to make it, but can you just give us a preview of what you're going to talk about? Because my auntie, my grandma, my grandpa, my whomever is afflicted with this, and we want to know more about it, right? And we did the same thing on the west side of Chicago. We canvassed these neighborhoods, and we would pass out flyers. And whether you're in a gang, whether you just, at a mom and pop store, the community really rallied behind us, because this is something that disproportionately, Alzheimer's and dementia is something that disproportionately affects our community, but you're not going to find any neuropsychologists in our communities. Like, you're going to have to take 2 trains and a bus, 2 buses and a train to go to some research facility. And if you go to a research facility, chances are they're going to put you on a waiting list, or you're going to have to go to somebody's suburbs and be the only African-American there, and they may not be equipped to be able to work with African-Americans. So when you have somebody that's going into your community talking about something that's super impactful, that's a difference maker. And I don't think my school at the time really appreciated that, because it was so avant-garde, right? Like the whole idea is about research, theory. But when you have somebody that's actually doing the work, that's like, whoa, that's something a little bit different. So, I mean, long story short, that was like the gift and the curse, right? That the school wasn't receptive to it, but it just gave me leverage to do what I wanted to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. And you saw I threw you folks a curveball, because that was not one of our scripted questions. And I love it, because I think that we had to capture that moment, because we as Black researchers also are in that question of why is it that our aging and health important, right? And so it's fantastic that you folks said that. And I see Dr. Epps in the chat. Thank you very much. And I agree that thank you to gentlemen for being so transparent and impactful like that. So to segue and actually to build on to your point about canvassing the community, what are some ways that we are currently failing Black men in our research and health interventions? And I like what you said, and I want you to kind of keep going, Dr. Howard, if you don't mind, because you already started talking about how you're conducting research in a different way than the academy.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a number of ways that you can approach it, though, right? So something that I learned working with Dr. Monica Parker at Emory was like, if you could get the matriarch involved or on board with what you're doing, then she's going to send the Black men in your family running to her. But you have to find a way to establish that trust, right? So how do you establish the trust? Like, the biggest thing is being present. When I did a fellowship at University of Michigan, and they were saying like, hey, we can't recruit Black Detroit. Well, it's like, okay, well, you get all these people from whatever the case may be, but they're not naturally in that community, right? So I got to get my hair cut by an African-American barber, right? Or when I grocery shop, or when I go to church, I'm in this community. So if we're doing research together, then I can't just disappear, right? Because one of the biggest problems with research is like, okay, you do this grand effort, you get people involved, all this fanfare, but then when it's time to show the results, nobody comes back to say what they found, right? So it's like, what's the point of me doing it? Because it harkens back to really not bygone era, but it harkens back to medical mismanagement, where, okay, you did this research on us, but we don't know the results, right? So, I mean, I think that's a problem in itself. But also, like, I was just so fortunate, like, because neuropsychology is something that I'm passionate about, that when I was in Chicago and I get my haircut, like, on the west side of the city, like, it would be people from all walks of life. Like, that's the amazing thing about an African-American barbershop, is that you have people from all walks of life. You have your professionals, you got your blue-collar people, you got whatever. And so sometimes, like, the barber would just ask me, like, well, what do you think about Alzheimer's? What do you think about dementia? What do you think about mental health? What do you think about the gun violence going on in the city? And what it would turn into a conversation, right? Where people will express their opinions. Not that I'm an expert, or I was an expert at the time, but I was in a position to answer the question, right?
Right.
That doesn't happen too often. So it's like these questions just fester inside people because they don't know where to go, who to talk to, and what to do about it.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. Dr. Skipper, In what ways are we currently failing our older Black men in research and intervention?
What ways are we currently failing our older Black men? I think, well, one of which that we've been talking about the whole time is kind of this lack of inclusion in research. And as a Black man, I'm always, kind of surprised by that. So I'm always surprised when I think that obvious things aren't being addressed. So as a Black man, I'm like, of course people are studying Black men. It's a very obvious area. And then you find out that there's a very, very small body of research on Black men in general and older Black men in particular. And so we definitely have to work at being more inclusive, but I also think in doing so, we have to challenge this deficit narrative that we often see brought about when we start talking about Black men. And that starts with this comparison group. Often we have, Black men being compared to white men or Blacks being compared to whites. And then when we do so, we want to talk about the deficits of, Black men or the deficits of Black folks in general. And I think, that is one of the things that's really hurting research as it relates to older Black men. And it's become so ingrained in Black culture. I taught a class at Winston-Salem State University, and the class was on Black fathering. And I would open the class by asking the students, who were majority Black, to describe Black fathers in 3 words. And of course, I heard all of the stereotypical thing, dad's been gone, dad's never home, all of the things that, come about when we think about Black fathering. I would then talk about, I would then give kind of this case example where I would have one father and I would compare that father to someone else, and there was no race in the comparison, but I would ask the students, okay, which is the better father? And they would all pick the same father. And then we would talk about the contextual factors. Well, why do you think that this father isn't as good as this one over here? So we would begin to add context to what it is that we're thinking about. And I think that that's one of the things that we fail to do often when we discuss older Black men is we don't consider the context of all these men are experiencing, all that these men are going through. And so it's not fair to build this comparison to somebody else or some other group when we don't really understand the context of all that's going on with Black men. I mean, there are some amazing researchers that have talked about the importance of doing this within group research around Black men. Doctors Thorpe, Doctors Whitfield, Dr. Griffith, all of these folks that are doing some amazing work. And I think we have to realize that we don't necessarily have to buy into this narrative that we need a comparison group, because we don't know enough about older Black men in and of itself to even begin having a comparison group. And so we have to do a lot more within group research. And again, just kind of challenge that whole deficit narrative. And working with Black couples, as shared earlier, one of the main things that I do is try and focus on strength-focused research and really kind of take this strength-focused approach to doing research, in that even in considering the health of Black folks or the health of Black men, we've learned a lot about what's wrong, right? And we always want to talk about what's wrong. But many times, if I've learned about what's going right in the lives of Black men and older Black folks that I sample, I can address a lot of what is going wrong. And so that's where I get at when I begin to look at, the role of religion and the role of fictive kin and the role of social networks and social support, and look at all that's going right within the Black community and with older Black folks, and use that information to then address many of the things that are going wrong. And so I think we need a lot more people to kind of adopt that approach and realize we don't necessarily need that comparison. That comparison group, to realize that we can take these strength-focused approaches and realize that many of us as Black folks have like this purpose to kind of address that, whether it's professionally or personally or whatever. But there's power in that purpose. And when we recognize that, like, we can unleash a lot of power through that purpose in the communities that we're really trying to serve.
Thank you. So what I hear is lack of inclusion, comparison with the white majority, lack of cultural context, deficit angles, and on that point, I would like us to actually move this conversation forward by saying, what are some ways or what are some things you're seeing in research that are actually serving the older Black men well? So, Dr. Skipper.
Okay, is that for me? So some things that are actually serving the Black man well, and I think you know, my good brother pointed it out when he mentioned that he is a great member of the Noble Clan, you know, Kappa Alpha Psi, as I am as well.
Yo, yo.
But I think that that's one of the things, and talking to other folks, like in the fraternity, in Black fraternities, it doesn't end after college in many ways that the white fraternity may, but this is a lifelong commitment. And this is something that people are a part of, you know, for life. And so I think that that social group and having that social group is something that's serving many Black men well. Even those that aren't members of a fraternity, I think we as Black folks do an amazing job of establishing fictive kin. And we have folks that we call brother that aren't necessarily our brother. And so having that relationship and having someone that you know is there to lean on and to talk with, those things are very important for Black men. I've made it a habit to reaching out to my good friends and just saying, hey man, just tell me how you are. How are you? And don't tell me that you're fine. Don't tell me, oh, everything cool, you know, oh, all is well. Don't give me the generic response. We're going to genuinely talk about how you are. And that's something that I don't believe enough Black men are doing. But as I alluded to earlier, I think we are becoming much more open to having conversations around mental health. And so one of the things that I think are doing a better job of serving Black men and Black folks in general are Black folks. And that we're coming to the realization that we can have these conversations, that we can break down these walls of things that we consider to be stigma or taboo, or conversations that we can't necessarily have. And so I think that that's been huge. Also, as Dr. Howard touches on, you know, the importance of the church and kind of building those connections with the church, having an interest in religion and health. Often I look towards the church and building connections within the church as a way of recruiting and making valuable and real connections with other Black men. And so I think that that is a great area as well.
Thank you. Thank you for talking about those protective factors. Dr. Howard, I would like you to talk about methodologies, like research methodologies, clinical methodologies that we can actually use to better research in older Black men.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things I wanted to say to Dr. Skipper's point was that, you know, just being an African-American male is like being in a fraternity of itself. Like a lot of times we get the, you know, African-Americans, we don't talk, we don't open up. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's just that sometimes it's hard to develop that trust amongst us. But usually when African-American men get together and stuff, one of the things that ends up happening is that, you know, we just have that level of conversation. Just a random story. I remember when my father passed away, and I got back to Atlanta and stuff, and I was supporting one of my friends because he's like a clothes designer. And it was just like maybe 3 other random Black men, and we were just kind of sitting at the bar. And, you know, next thing you know, we just kind of started talking about life. And it was like the closest thing that we had to like group counseling, because in some form or fashion, everybody was just kind of going through it. And like that's one of the things with African-American men is like a level of social connectedness. And like even looking at the church, it was the comedian Dick Gregory. He was like, you know, the church was a place where you could talk about a promotion at work or a new car, or your child going to college without being judged or anything bad, because any place else in the world, now you have too much money, or now you think you're better than everybody else, or whatever the case. So there's a power of social connectedness in church. I'm working on a research paper now that's looking at cognition, health literacy, and social connectedness amongst African Americans. And what the research is kind of saying so far is that because with health literacy, a lot of times what ends up happening is like particularly if you're in a Midwest city or Rust Belt city like Detroit or Chicago, Indianapolis, Cleveland, whatever the case may be, you're segregated to one side of town. And even if you're making 6 figures, if you're segregated to a certain side of town, chances are you're not going to have like the best hospital there or the best mental health care. So what it becomes is a matter of logistics. So even if you can like read really well or have a high level of cognition, if you really get to one side of town, then chances are you're going to have like a level of high health disparities. But one of the things about social connectedness is just kind of like, it's a quintessential, I don't know, can you tell me the answer, right? Because we're all sitting maybe in this barbershop, we're all sitting in this church, we're all sitting wherever the case may be. And now we can just have a conversation and we can aggregate resources, right? So, I mean, I guess that kind of goes into your methodology question, but to a certain extent, like, yeah, I mean, there's power in the church and not to evangelize, but there's this untapped market that's there that a lot of times researchers don't go into just because they don't understand how dynamic the Black church is, not even from a metaphysical standpoint, but also from a standpoint of, you know, being able to have community, to be able to share, to be able to have a support system, which offsets a lot of the things that cause a huge stressors in African American men's life. Just to be able to have that community to express itself, to be your natural you, and not to, you know, spend tirelessly trying to keep up this wall or keep the shell together.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a theme here that we're hearing and we've seen in research as well, the importance of church and religiosity in the health and wellness of Black men, etc. And also, Dr. Skipper talked about within group differences. So study within group similarities and patterns. That way we can actually address the issues that come up. And now I'm just summing up some methodological things that we should focus on. You were talking earlier about community psychology and canvassing the area and using methods that we know that work for Black people to collect data, etc. So, and that actually leads us. Did you have something to say?
Oh, no. I was just going to just talk about sort of methodology, but I think we kind of discussed that unless you want me to go further about it, but it's okay.
No, we're good. So segueing again into the next question, which is nicely dovetailing here. Attracting older men to research studies is a challenge, and this has been documented quite a bit. So, in your opinion, what are we not addressing? What are we not doing right in recruiting the older Black men to research? What are we missing?
Is that for me or for Dr.
Skipper? Dr. Skipper can take it.
Okay, awesome. So I think it's great that we're discussing, you know, canvassing in the Black church and all of these different things and ways to reach older Black men. But I think it boils down, honestly, to me, to three very simple R's, and that's research requires relationships. What we're not doing well is building relationships with the communities in which these individuals reside. And often it's understandably difficult because many of us are in spaces where it's like, hey, I need this data and then I need to hurry up and publish, or, you know, it's about publications or scientific reach and things of those of that nature. But often we get so caught up in that we neglect the relationships that provide us the samples to do these things effectively and for hard to reach populations. I'm reminded of a book by Zora Neale Hurston, book called Barracoon. It's about an older Black man. Interview takes place in 1927. Hurston interviews him because she identifies him as the last known living person who could recount firsthand what it was like to be taken from Africa and brought to the Americas as a slave. And she opens with, you know, a very simple question. I want to know who you are and how you came to become a slave. And so Hurston would sit down and interview, you know, this gentleman who went by the name of Cujo, but it would take her months and many meetings to answer that very simple question. Several of the initial meetings, she got nothing from them. They would just sit and Cujo would say, no, I just want to have watermelon and hum. And he would sit, she would sit there with him as they ate watermelon and hum, and he would hum. And so many times she was there building this relationship, taking absolutely no data from this interview. And I think, you know, that's what we have to realize is that when working with older Black men, that relationship has to be there. You can't do the research without the relationship. We understand the places to go. And so we've talked about, you know, the Black church. We've talked about the barbershop. The convenience store is a big one, particularly in rural communities. Older Black men often hang out at the convenience store. But unless you have that relationship with those places, then it's not going to work. And so many times it's about getting into those spaces and building relationships with, at the very least, the gatekeepers that can then introduce you to others and then staying within that network. You know, Dr. Howard talks about how he can't take data and run because he still has to go back to that barbershop and get his hair cut. I don't really have, you know, the same issue. Haven't had that experience in quite some time, but you have to be able to exist in these communities that you're also utilizing and taking data from. I think, you know, another thing that we can do better is we talked about reaching Black men. I was very fortunate in recognizing that, as Dr. Howard shares, many older Black men have a woman in their lives that is able to talk to them and really kind of get them involved into research or even opening up and talking. And so in working with couples, I was able to see that a lot. Connecting with HBCUs. HBCUs are often powerhouses in the communities that they reside, right? Like, they're well respected. And many times we have to touch bases with these HBCUs and involve their faculty, involve individuals there if we want to get into those communities, and be reasonable as you do it. Having come from an HBCU, you can't reach out to me and say, I need this lit review back in 3 days or a week, because I'm teaching 4 classes and I'm on 10 committees. So we need to do a better job of connecting with HBCUs, but also recognizing that the workload is very different at a HBCU than it is at some of the institutions in which we may be teaching or learning. I guess lastly, I would say what we could really do better, in addition to compensating our communities, particularly after the pandemic, you go in with a $20, $25 gift card, a lot of times you'll get laughed at. And so we need to provide proper compensation for our communities, but we also need to realize that as researchers, we're existing on sacred ground. I remember an older woman told me, you don't know anything about what it means to be old just because you've read a few books. I said, you are absolutely right. And it brought me to this realization that I'm on sacred ground. I'm studying folks that have an experience that's different from my experience. And I have to respect that I can't necessarily be the experience because I've studied something that they've lived. And so I think we have to do a much better job of recognizing that, you know, we're on this sacred ground in reaching out to Black communities and trying to involve Black men in research.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean,
Dr. Howard.
I totally agree. I think Dr. Jennifer Manley, I want to credit her with saying this and stuff, because I know her name and Dr. Lisa Barnes are littered throughout my dissertation, but I think she said something kind of interesting, right? When you work with African Americans, Hispanics, Muslims, it's about the relationship, where sometimes when you work with other groups of people, it's about the prestige, right? So you could be like, well, I went to Duke or I went to Yale, Princeton, and most African Americans are going to be like, okay, what's that relationship like with us? Can we establish a relationship? Like, what can we do? Because if we can't establish a relationship, I don't care where you went to school at, but I'm just not going to trust you, right? And so you see the power in having relationships in almost every iteration of schooling, of life, or whatever the case may be. Like, I may be the neuropsychologist, but if I have an older male barber, then I'm going to talk to him about advice, like, hey, my family's this, or my career is this, or whatever the case may be, because it's about establishing the relationship and having like a level of respect. So one of the things that we have to be mindful of also, and Dr. Skipper really, hit the nail on the head with this, is like when we invest in the HBCUs, is like, how do we invest in our communities, right? Because you could get a whole bunch of people from wherever the case with the big name university, and you plant something right in the middle of Normal, Alabama, or Huntsville, Alabama, and you think, okay, we're going to work with everybody from North Alabama. No, Alabama A&M, like, we reign supreme up there, right? The population, the community has a relationship with us. So you'll be better served almost to say, how can we get these students who people trust or whatever in our institution, rather than having somebody that has no connection with the institution? Because what ends up happening is that people who aren't invested or who aren't connected with the community, once the 9 to 5, okay, once 5 o'clock rolls around, okay, they're going back home, right? Whereas you got people who are going to church, or these are the family members. These are the people who are so well connected in the community. This is how we make the difference. So this is why I always get concerned when I see like different research facilities, or when I see different VAs in historically African-American communities, cities, and they don't have anybody from the community working there, right? And it's like, so what are you really trying to do? Like, what are you really trying to push, right? So I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think relationships are imperative. Like, I think those things are paramount.
And on that point, Amanda James in the chat. Now we're segueing into the interaction with the attendees here. Amanda James says, "I love research requires relationships," which is your point, Dr. Howard. So how can we get universities and funders to understand that the time for building relationships is so important? So basically, you're funded for 3 years. You need some time to build relationships, but they want your money to be used and you account for it in 3 years. So could you address that? How could we?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be mutually beneficial. Like, I'm not your workhorse, right? Like, like Dr. Golden Bird says, we're not the Negro farm. You learn how to like be able to recruit African Americans, but I think it's important, right? Like, one of the things, like, for instance, like, I'm not from Alabama, but I spent a lot of time there. In Alabama, you have this black belt that stretches from almost touching from Mississippi, almost to touching Georgia, right? All these African American communities that's over 50% black. And within that black belt, you're not going to see like any type of neuropsychologist. You're barely seeing any type of doctor. And it's like, but most of these kids from these communities either go to Alabama State, usually go to Tuskegee, usually go to Alabama A&M, goes to Miles. And we have among the biggest classic, the Magic City Classic, where Alabama State and Alabama A&M meet in Birmingham. So it's like, well, why don't you reach out to the psych departments from each school and have some sort of neuro bowl, right? Like neuropsychology bowl, right? Where they answer questions about neuroanatomical features, or you talk about like, you know, traumatic brain injuries, acquired brain injuries, and you have these students bring their family out because everybody's going to be in Birmingham anyway, right? So this is how you get people out, but the students are having opportunity to build their CV, to be affiliated with UAB or some research facility, right? So it's mutually beneficial, because one of the things that people hate in any walks of life is being taken advantage of, right? I bring the community out, I bring out the resources, I establish the trust for you, and now that you get what you want, you're nowhere to be found, right? That becomes the biggest problem, is saying, like, I respect you enough that not only do you do this hard work for us, but I'm going to give you something that's equally beneficial in return, right? Because when people are receiving something that's going to help them and edify their careers, they're going to be more inclined to like really establish this pipeline, right? Because you could do all, and this is what we see all the time in research, and this is what you see all the time in community outreach, is you do all this research and then you just forget about people. But what you also see is that when you take care of people, then people are more inclined to say, hey, you know what, you come along, like, because this helped me out, this can help you out. Word of mouth is paramount in perpetuating good research.
Dr. Skipper, same question. How can we get universities and funders to realize that building these relationships take time and they're important?
Yeah, I think absolutely agree with Dr. Howard has shared. I also want to touch on kind of building a team, right? And I think one of the things that happened last year, it resulted from a tragedy, but we got universities and we got funders and we got all of these different institutions that started talking about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so I realized, like, at that moment, like, oh, this is an opportunity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build it into our strategic plan. What we're going to do is we're going to make room for the time and things that it require. If you really want me to touch bases with, you know, the minority community, if you really want me to get into the Black community, then it's going to take time to build those relationships. And I think that, you know, having all of the conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion kind of opened the door to be able to do that. And so I think with this kind of team-based approach and getting with others that are in the university system as well, to say, hey, we're going to go out into this space and we're going to develop this relationship. I know here at Georgia State, we have a group that just focuses on research in Atlanta. And so that's all we do is we meet and we talk about, well, what are you doing within the city? Well, what are you doing within the city? And then the university, you know, kind of broadcasts that, and they create this space for research that's just in Atlanta. And so I think if other spaces also adopted that, we have to realize that even when working with funders, you know, as Dr. Howard kind of shares, like, we're the ones doing the work, like, you're providing the funding, and I'm very thankful for it. But I'm also the expert in this area. And if you write it in a way to where I need time in order to be able to conduct this research, and that time is going to require relationships, then I think that, you know, we could get those, you know, higher ed institutions and those funders and things on board to realize that it's very unique in working with older Black populations.
Yeah, and I like that. So basically, when they're asking you for the timeline, you actually write in there that I'll need 6 months or 4 months to really go and talk to these folks, the barbers, etc. I like that a lot. So Sharon William has a question also for you, panelists, and this is kind of a long, complicated question, so bear with me. Sharon, if you want to unmute and speak for yourself, that's fantastic too. But Sharon says, how do you think the health of today's 20-year-old Black male who will be 65 in 2066 will differ from today's 65-year-old male who was born in 2046? So basically, it's just asking a generational difference. So how will it look for 65-year-olds today versus 65-year-old in 2066?
Man, you know what? That's a really good question. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, because the research data says like 20-year-olds right now, 44% of African-American males have some varying form of cardiovascular disease. Like over 20, it's almost more than half that has some varying form of like pre-diabetes, diabetes, or something like that. But at the same time, what's kind of interesting is like now more than ever, resources are more readily available. Like before, like there used to be a point in time where like African Americans would go through the worst, like work a job for 40 years. It wasn't like bouncing from job to job to job to job and stuff. But now like there's more opportunities to garner wealth, more resources in terms of mental health resources, all the things that contribute to living a better life, a longer life and stuff. But also there's more detriments. I mean, I think this newer generation's more into the drug culture. They're more into, just different things of the sort. So I think it could be two extremes. It could either be like really well, or it could be like really bad. I think this new generation, despite all the resources, I think they're under a lot of more stress. Yeah, because things like more resources are available, there's more things expected from them. So.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. And real quick, Dr. Skipper, before we close.
Yes, I second that. I think that I think we'll live longer, but I don't think the quality of life will be there because, we have all of these innovations and things that will help us to live longer. But I think that the same things we were dealing with 60 years ago, we're realizing like these things are still around and they're still impacting folks. And so I think that, I'm not sure that the quality of life will be there, even for Black men in, 40, 50 years, which is discouraging to say, honestly.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skipper. And I wish we had more time. I know people have responsibilities to take care of. So I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to the two speakers, Dr. Howard and Dr. Skipper, for giving us your time and your effort in planning for this webinar. And thank you also for sharing your knowledge, because we do not acknowledge that enough. And we want to make sure that we acknowledge that that's a resource that you gave to us for free, and we appreciate you for your time. Thank you again to our speakers for their time, and thank you to the audience for being fantastic and asking questions and interacting with us. We encourage you to keep talking to us, follow us on Instagram, follow us on all the platform medias that we have. And I would like also to thank you all for giving us fantastic questions to think about. So from us at BIGG, we thank you so much for being with us. And there's a lot of events coming up next week, the week after. Follow us on Twitter to learn more about the event. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll talk soon.